Well, good morning and happy Year of the Rabbit. Happy Lunar New Year. And welcome home. We're glad you're here. We welcome all who are here online or now or later or whenever. We hope that wherever you are in your journey, you'll look to us as to this place or this time or these people as a safe space to grow and explore your own relationship with God. And even as your understanding of God changes and your views of God change, that you'll still find growth and safety to explore those. Last week I introduced a series, basically a mini-series. It was last week and this week, just a two-parter. And we talked about the biblical application of the imagery of yokes, those things that go on the necks of animals or of people even to help balance the weight. We looked at the Old Testament usage of that metaphor as a sign of oppression and adding to burdens. And then we talked about how Christ's own words in the Gospels took that and applied new meaning, as Christ often did. Took the old and applied new meaning. And Christ's own words reimagined that yoke as easy, even restful, rather than resentful. A way to work as a team with Emmanuel, God with us, and even as a way to kind of offload some of our own burden. Today I want to go a little further into the New Testament, and we'll talk about Paul's second letter to the church at Corinth and his introduction of the same type of imagery. Specifically, I want to dive right into 2 Corinthians, chapter 6, verses 14 and 15. And many have heard this, it's been preached about forever. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? Unfortunately, this passage has been used to encourage people to isolate and to even shun anyone who has different beliefs. It's been used to basically say, hey, don't hang out with sinners. Don't hang out with non-believers. Don't do this. You see, this illustration is actually becoming one of the most intriguing to me. It's one of my favorite things about reading the Bible and even reading commentaries and other input about the Bible. It makes me face certain things like, what do I do when I have this growing belief in God through the lens of love, acceptance, and even universal inclusion, and that growing belief meets a scriptural passage that seems to take God in a different direction? How do I reconcile that? Do I just throw it all away and go, I'm just going to go back to the old ways because obviously I was wrong? This is one of those passages that's used to discourage relationships, for everything from just hanging out or just fellowshipping or going to dinner with someone to considering marriage. So it's definitely something that needs to be considered. It's not something we run away from. And in years past, I would fear that challenge. Anything that came against any beliefs I had was just fearful. Like, no, it cannot be. Now I look at it a little differently. Yes, there are some things I kind of set on a shelf for now. But I don't know how to rectify that. I don't know what to do with that. But then eventually I can come around and go, okay, passages like this, let's look at it. What if the lens is different? How do we still look at that? And it's important to take context into the picture. You know, let's look at Paul's letter. Where in the Bible is this? Well, in this case, it's not an Old Testament perspective. And that does matter. Because if you've been following the church for a while, if you've been kind of listening to sermons, things like that, you may recall, months ago, I preached on the concept of the blood of Abel and how that influenced so much in the Old Testament, and how Christ talks about the blood of Abel and how we now have a choice and go in that. The Old Testament, there was no choice. It was all about the blood of Abel and the need for balance, to achieve balance in that regard. Remember, we're talking about yokes. So in order to achieve balance for blood, you had to have more blood. And in order to, So, but now we can say, okay, this letter to Paul was after Christ's sacrifice, after Christ redefined all of that. So we don't have to apply those old thought patterns. And so next, who's credited as the author? Now, a lot of books of the Bible have some dispute over who the authors are, but it's pretty solid that this one was Paul. He was writing to the Corinthians. It says, "Hi, I'm Paul." Yeah, maybe some of his assistants helped him later or filled in blanks. And of course, translation, blah, blah, blah. But let's just say Paul. Paul's a widely acknowledged good guy in the Bible. He's a major player in the formation of the early church. Now, but it's not Jesus. It's not the one who was quoted in last week's sermon about having a yoke that's easy and provides rest. It's pretty safe to say, though, that Paul knew about what Jesus had said. And it's also safe to say that Paul knew about previous mentions in what we now call the Old Testament. And he definitely knew about the book of Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, which says in Deuteronomy 22, "Do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together." And see, Paul's building on that. This is part of the Jewish teachings with this whole list of, I think right after it is don't wear wool and linen combined, and it's got all the do's and don'ts. And Paul was a member of the educated sect. I won't go back all into that, but he obviously knew his Pentateuch. He knew his law. And he also knew that the Corinthians would recognize the allusion to the yoke. If not from Christ's words, maybe they may or may not have known about that, but they definitely knew about the idea of trying to strap an ox to a donkey and get anything done. So it's a very functional illustration, kind of like what I talked about last week. Even those of us who didn't grow up on a pre-industrial farm can probably imagine what would happen if we were to try that. If we were to have a field to plow or even just someplace to go, and we had a cart and we needed 2 animals and we found this big ox and then a little donkey to go next to it and thought, well, let's try this. I mean, at best, you're going to go in circles because that poor little donkey can't, And at worst, just the whole thing's going to collapse and, you get a mad ox and a dead donkey and you don't get anywhere. So kind of like if you've ever been in a canoe, like floating the river or something, and I remember I vaguely remember being like with a grown-up when I was a kid in a canoe, and it was so frustrating for the grown-up. So if you think about it, if one's up at the front paddling on one side, one's in the back paddling on the other, and they're both going as hard as they can, but one's a little kid and one's a big professional athlete, what's going to happen? Well, at best, you're going to go in a circle wherever that little kid, to the side the little kid's paddling, because they can't possibly keep up. So it's kind of like that. It's also important with this illustration to consider the audience and the writing itself. We know Paul was writing to the early church of Corinth, but why? Now, I'm not going to read the whole letter, but chapter 1 does include kind of an explanation that Paul had originally planned to be there in person, to visit twice, on his way somewhere and on his way back. But it appears that the plans had changed, because he writes kind of almost a little defensive, like, hey, I really wanted to be there, I couldn't, and I didn't because it was a protection for you. So that leads me, I'm making my own conclusions here. This is the book of Jenny, this isn't thus saith the Lord. It sounds kind of like the Corinthians were taking the change of plans maybe personally. Like, oh, some big bad teacher doesn't want to come hang out with us. And maybe it was causing them to grumble a bit and feel left out. There's other commentaries I read talked about the kind of cultural aspect going on at the time. And specific. Wow. Okay. Yes, Lord? Sorry about the book of Jenny comment. I know, it's not in the Bible. I got it. Okay. If the lightning hits, you all are safe. It'll just be back here. So, it's a bunch of different, some of the different commentaries mention that in that, what was going on in Corinth is they had, of course, established this church. Remember, the early church, they're just building their foundation. These aren't about nitpicky little things. These are establishing this foundational concept. And apparently in Corinth, it was big. And so that was kind of a traveling place. And these big shots would come through with their own messages and their own teachings and their own, I'm an apostle. I'm an apostle of this or an apostle of that. And the Corinthians were just kind of latching on to whatever the new, shiniest, brightest apostle was coming into town. Kind of like these big televangelists, like, ooh. And they were also falling for this kind of trap that I don't know if you might see around here nowadays. I wouldn't dare to think it could ever happen here. But they began mixing with politics and mixing with this power struggle. And, well, if I latch onto this belief, then I can get more leverage here. And they're kind of going for the brightest, shiniest penny. Does that make sense? So the belief system was getting mixed messages, and they didn't really know where they were going with it. And it was definitely straying from that foundation concept. And so Paul was writing about this. And, the idea of the dangers of following whoever had the best big tent revival, or whoever carried the most status, or had the most power. They tended to kind of gravitate. So Paul's warning people not to allow the corrupt teachings. He's writing to the elders of the church. He's warning them not to allow this corruption to seep in. And not to try to have personal gain from the message, if that makes sense. See, and nowadays the Western church often teaches that it means you can't fellowship with folks who don't follow the same teachings. But Paul was writing more about the power dynamic of that. The ox and the donkey. There's definitely a power imbalance when you're talking about a yoke and a plow. That's the ox all the way. That's what they're built for. Donkeys will also beasts of burden. Neither are bad, but they have a different task. They can carry stuff. They can pull too, but that's not the main gift to give. And so you're trying to group two animals into one pathway that is not conducive to getting anything done, and it hurts them both. And so that's kind of what Paul's talking about. It's this shallow concept, that when we take it and make it a shallow concept of, I can't hang out with you because you're not Trinitarian, or because, even if you say nowadays, I can't hang out with you because you're not a believer. Yes, the scripture does say, don't fellowship with unbelievers. Also remember at the time, when Paul's talking about Belial, he's talking about, that was a term used kind of as an encompassing thing. It could either mean Satan himself, or it can mean kind of like any kind of evil you can imagine. So it's not just a different set of beliefs. It's, if I start not just hanging out with folks who think that we should go sacrifice babies, that's kind of a big deal. Not just hanging out, but getting sucked into believing that way. Again, remember, the Corinthians were getting sucked into just believing this or that. It's not that they were hanging out, it's that they weren't plowing their own line. They weren't just hanging out with you. They were like following whoever could lead them to the most power. And by doing so, they're corrupting. And you're getting so easily sucked into things. If you turn that into saying you can't forge relationships, or you can't forge relationships unless it's really just a pet project because you're going to lead someone to Christ. You see how that damages relationships too? If I go out to say I'm going to hang out with someone or get to know them, and my only goal in the back of my mind is, well, if I get to know you, then I can bring you to Christ and save you from hell. See, it all interconnects. If you want to get to know someone, just get to know someone. Don't add that yoke of trying to achieve some sort of project with them. I'm sorry, I digress. Unequally yoked is less about who you hang out with, and it's more about binding yourself in imbalanced relationships. Don't give up your power, and don't abuse your power, whatever relationship you're in. It also means you can have, there's circles of influence. A lot of us know this. You know, you can hang out with people, fellowship with people. It doesn't mean you're going to marry them. And we take that so far to be like, oh, if they don't have beliefs, we can't be near you, or we can't, because you'll corrupt me. Well, if you are that unsteady in your beliefs, then yeah, maybe there is a time you kind of need to hang out, to isolate, but it's not a long-term thing. When I was younger, I would hang out a lot. Even in my early working, out past college days, they had smoke breaks a lot. And I got to where it was like, well, why are all these people getting to go outside for a smoke break? So I would start going out and hanging out with the smokers. Well, guess what? Yeah, I started smoking. Well, I had smoked as a teenager too, so I can't really blame them. But it's not because I was hanging out that was the problem. The problem was I let that get to me, and I'm not slamming smokers. But if you're in a position where you can hang out and not let it corrupt you, then you're fine. And again, it's more about individuals. We try to force things into these equations when really it's about individuals. So please don't let this passage force you to isolate. We all have lists, especially when it comes to like who we want to date, or who we want to marry, or who, I mean, if I wanted to date and marry someone, my wife might not like that. But, and it's up to you where you put beliefs on the list and how lockstep they have to be. If it's very important to you that someone not only believe in God, but believe it this way and that way, no, that's fine. But please don't let it be because of this passage. Because you can still plow a field if you're going the same direction. You don't have to be in lockstep to still get a field plowed. Will there be obstacles? Absolutely. Regardless of your beliefs, there will be obstacles. Will there be detours? Sure. Will there be struggles? Yes. Will you slip? Yes. But if whoever you're yoked with, whether that's a spouse or even tight friendships, it can grow. If whoever you're yoked with can help, and it's a positive impact on both of you, then it's okay. It's a good thing. Only you can decide that. See, the burden of this is you can't just plug this in and say, I can't hang out with you. You have to do that effort. You have to have the courage to say, this is unhealthy. Or this is healthy. Or maybe instead of a yoke, you just have more of a cord. They're a little further out. Like a leash. I don't want to get into all that, but I just walked into that one. A lunge line. But you can also have relationships. You can fellowship with people even if you don't agree with them. And you don't have to use this concept of unequally yoked. Unequally yoked is about ceding your power. Not just in compromise. Not just like saying, okay, let's agree to disagree on this or that. That's all good. But if you are trying to become someone else in order to fit in their yoke, Especially like the Corinthians were doing to try to gain power. Like, ooh, if I follow them more closely, if I kiss up to them, and I can get in their yoke, and they rely on me, then as they succeed, I'll get a name for myself. As they, and by that, we're applying the wrong attributes. If you're just trying to drag on someone's coattails, that's unequally yoked. The same if you're in a position of power or authority and you're using that to leverage people, to get them to do your bidding or force them into something that they don't really want to do or coerce them, unequally yoked. Whether you take it to the extreme of quid pro quo, sexual harassment, any of that, unequally yoked. But that doesn't mean, well, like I said, that doesn't mean you can't love people. It doesn't mean you can't get close to people who have different beliefs. Again, remember, the context back then was different beliefs meant they want to sacrifice babies to another god. Here, different beliefs may mean they don't go to church on Sundays, they don't believe in God, but they still do good stuff, they still believe in love, they still, or it may even be less of a deal than that. Maybe high liturgy, low liturgy, it's however you want to take it. Maybe they vote a different way. Maybe they, whoever the they is. Maybe they're transubstantiationists. Forgive me if I said that wrong. Maybe they believe it's symbolic of the communion, symbolic of the body and blood. Maybe they believe it is the body and blood. I mean, people have lost relationships over this stuff. And they've lost it based on this whole idea that, I cannot be unequally yoked with you. And it's like, really? If that's your consideration, fine. But don't blame it on Paul. Because Paul's talking about the whole imbalance of power thing. Paul's talking about, don't get sucked into saying that Jesus wants a sacrifice of babies. Don't add that to the church doctrine. Again, different time. They were trying to establish a baseline. They're not getting nitpicky here. Being equally yoked can mean learning how to set boundaries. Not to isolate, but to better acclimate to the real world and real people. Some folks you'll carry closer. Some folks you'll have higher intimacy with. Some folks you won't. Perhaps you want to consider your relationships with the idea that the ones closest to you, the ones most able to help carry you forward, are the ones who hopefully are at least kind of going in the same general direction and have a similar build of yours. But you don't discount the ones who don't. Also remember, you may not be seeing it correctly. It doesn't have to be identical. You don't even have to define it with the same words. It runs along with the concept of soul ties, spiritual ties. Some cords or connections are more loose than others. More like, I'll run into you when I run into you. Or let's hang out, or let's do this, or let's do that. And some are more tight. And there will be changes, and you will mess up. The main thing about being unequally yoked, the main thing Paul's saying, I believe, is just don't fall for altering who you are to impress someone else or to try to gain some sort of earth-based advantage or to kind of step up or because all that clouds your judgment. You could end up trying to tie yourself to what you think is a big, strong ox, and instead, they turn out to be the ass. In more ways than one. Let us pray. Lord God, ultimate parent,